Good evening. Welcome to Community and Technology, where we connect the global community with news, information, and resources that'll hopefully help improve your life. I'm Stu Reed. Here's my co-host, Dave Bernstein. Hey, Dave.
Hello.
So what's going on, Dave, in the world of technology? I guess the big story this past week has been the Facebook outage. I mean, what was that about and why?
The Facebook outage was just an ordinary network problem that got compounded because they're running their data centers lights out, i.e. no people there. When it went down, they discovered that among the things that went down was the unlocking tool or the software to unlock the door, and they couldn't get into the data center to restart things for several hours.
You're right. You're talking about a physical door or a virtual door?
Physical door.
Get out of here, Dave. They couldn't get in the room?
Yeah, well, it was more than a room. It was a building, and it had lots of intense security. And the way to get in is you had to log in, and the login was one of the things that went down.
Whoa, wow.
Yeah. And it went down around the world. I don't think we have the exact details of what they did wrong when they were doing a network update, but this kind of thing happens.
It's happened before?
It hasn't happened on this scale to Facebook, but it's happened to hundreds, dozens, virtually every other network I know. Something went wrong at some point and it went down.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about having 99.9% or even 99.999% uptime. That's still not 100%.
Mm-hmm.
Systems go down. And a well-designed system will very rarely go down. But Gmail, for example, went down a few weeks ago, or maybe a couple of months ago. So it had nothing whatsoever to do with the people in Congress who are trying to figure out what to do about this rogue company. I have a suggestion.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't we persuade Mark Zuckerberg, who has a funny corporate structure that gives him total control, that $30 billion is enough for him and his family, and $300 billion of market capital is plenty for the company. Instead of the $1 trillion it was up to a few weeks ago before problems started happening. Would the world be a better place?
So are you suggesting a redeployment of that capital, Dave? Well, I mean, how would you suggesting things change?
In other words, accepting that Facebook doesn't have to grow very fast and could be an ethical company that is good for society and not do some of the exaggerated things that are, without a doubt, causing problems for the world. Think about that. What if Facebook didn't amplify the most extreme voices out there, everywhere in every country?
Mm-hmm.
What if Facebook didn't go into a country like Myanmar, where many people have died after terror inspired by Facebook postings, until they had a system set up to work well in Myanmar? There is a lot of hatred in this world. Facebook multiplies it, there's no doubt. Despite the 40,000 people they claim they have working on keeping the conversation going in a sensible way, mm-hmm. and not destructive, they've clearly failed. And all the people who work it know there is no solution just with software and computer systems to keep something like Facebook under control. So do you think if Facebook was controlled internally by not being so aggressive for profits, the world would be a better place.
Certainly, if it had that effect, without a doubt. I don't know enough about how the inner workings actually work. I did look at a story by one written by an ex-Facebook, I guess, technician that helped work on a lot of their internal coding, and written by a woman. And what she says is that, just to kind of amplify what you're saying, is that it's the internal algorithms of Facebook that are designed to amplify incendiary and inflammatory speech and images, and that coupled with the whole personalization, the way that the web is able to track, who you are and what you like, those two things combined are what drives a lot of the misinformation, and just kind of amplifies so much of, I'm going to quote from her. She says, they create uncontrollable attention-seeking beasts. Thought that was an interesting description of some of what's going on. And what this author proposed, again, she was a scientist working at Facebook, was that the companies like Facebook should be liable for the impact and the consequences of their algorithms. Slightly different from what you're saying, but maybe kind of just the flip side of the same statement. What she's saying is, if Facebook and others were liable for what happened because of their algorithmic content, then they would eliminate the algorithms. Does that make sense, Dave? Would that work?
It's an interesting one, because most of the people we know strongly defend Section 230, the thing that says the companies are not liable for what people post on YouTube or Facebook and so on. And it would be true. They would have no choice but to massively censor things, because there's no easy way to figure out what actually is libelous or harmful or incites violence. So in order to cut down on that, you have to cut off an enormous amount of speech. If I turned around and said, Donald Trump should be thrown out of the White House, am I suggesting a crowd come and grab him and toss him out? It's hard for a computer to make that decision. It's probably easier to just take any criticism of Donald Trump and cut it off Facebook. So, Section 230 is important, but this is an interesting compromise, that the companies are liable if they amplify and multiply, not just carry the speech. Because that's what happens. It turns out that there's enormous incentive, financial incentive, for the companies to bring the most outrageous and preposterous and threatening material to everybody's attention.
Wow.
Why? Because you do pay attention. You do watch, you do read the stuff that's out of the ordinary, extraordinary, incredibly forceful.
Connect that, Dave, with the financial incentive for our audience.
Well, one of the things that Facebook is constantly doing is trying to increase engagement. The time every investor looks at the time the average person spends on Facebook. So anything that persuades people to spend more time, like violent, threatening commentary, wildly exaggerated claims, pays off. People spend more time, they see more ads to click on, and Facebook's algorithms are tuned to pick up the most outrageous stuff out there
Mm-hmm.
and amplify it. So the amplification is pretty serious. Would we really be losing a lot for the world if Facebook simply showed you what all your friends were doing that you signed up for and maybe gave you a few categories you could get and offered you a news feed like Google News that could be personalized to your interest, but not to the extremity of point of view? I don't think so. I think the world would be much better off if we didn't expand hate. So this is not saying that people can't post hateful things on Facebook, but they can't expand it. Would it solve all the problems of the world? Of course not. Would it have eliminated the attack on the White House on January 6th? Probably not. A second thing that you'd want, if they weren't so concerned with doing everything possible to drive up earnings, is they might be a more honest and ethical company. The company is constantly lying in public statements. They're defending themselves right and left, sometimes with just ordinary lies about what they have and haven't found.
I mean, such as what, David? I mean, break that down for us. Give us a
Well,
recent
let me
example.
get down to something that's bigger because we happen to have the facts right from the top. Wildly misleading statements, very cleverly put. For example, it's clear to anybody who looks at the data that the attacks over Facebook and the calls to attack the White House over Facebook were part of what went on. Were not a good thing, should have been blocked, should not have been amplified. So how does Nicholas Clegg, a failed British politician that's Facebook's public space on this, answer it? Well, he refutes a claim that nobody made. He says, well, Facebook was not the only reason people attacked the White House on January 6th. And anybody who says that is wildly inaccurate and is distorting the truth. And the people attacking Facebook and wanting to change the way we do business, they are distorting the truth. Now that's a straw man. Nobody's saying that Facebook should be brought under some control, said that it's the only reason we had civil disobedience at the White House. And civil disobedience it was. And it went beyond that to violence in some cases. But Clegg, as I say, a failed British politician, he was once vice prime minister, whatever the title was, in a coalition government, is not willing to talk about what really was the problem. He, like a clever debater, tries to change the subject. That was distorting the debate, distorting the discussion. Currently, Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg, the two most prominent Facebook executives, refused to testify in Congress and refused to answer questions from Congress. Not a stand you'd want to take in a democracy. But it goes further. What is Facebook doing to make the world a better place? Should Facebook try to make the world a better place? Or should it just do what makes the money? Once upon a time, most Americans believed in corporate social responsibility. That Engine Charlie Wilson, if to be good for General Motors, would do things that were good for the United States. That's an old quote from the Eisenhower regime. Well, Facebook could have done things. Think of a very simple thing that could and should have been done. Facebook and YouTube, not compelling anybody to anything, could simply have put on the first screen a link to where one could get COVID testing and vaccine. Would anybody be harmed by that link? Well, it would have saved many lives because it would have made, by making it easier, more people would have been tested and vaccinated. Should that have happened? Should the pristine integrity of Google's homepage be interrupted by one line with a couple of links about COVID? Yes, it should.
I certainly agree, Dave. I mean, but the fundamental issue that you just put your finger on is the shift in our culture from social responsibility of major corporations to we're just in it for the money for our shareholders. How do we put that? The genie's out the bottle, or the genie's dead, depending on how you want to look at it. How do we reverse that? How do we change that? I mean, do we have to totally fall off the cliff for folks to wake up?
Well, some of the best people on Wall Street are actually addressing it. That's ESG, which I forget what it stands for, but it's about bringing responsibility for society into the corporate world. And if Facebook couldn't increase profits because it was limited somehow, would they be more responsible? Absolutely. Because Mark Zuckerberg is as decent a human being as you or I. In fact, in many ways, he's more decent than most. He really does care, according to a mutual friend, about getting everybody in the world connected. Although the way that Facebook did the internet.org that seemed to connect everybody to Facebook and not much else was a perversion. Zuckerberg meant well. He's committed, he and his wife have committed to giving away 99% of their incredible fortune. Not many people. Now, literally 1% of their fortune is more than enough for their grandchildren to be rich and any earthly desire they have. But that's something that many people won't do. There's much more.
But I think the point that you're making, Dave, is as decent as he may be, as well as other corporate leaders, they are actually operating within a context and within a culture and dynamics that are so huge and so powerful that they really can't turn things around themselves.
It turns out Facebook is the exception, because when he went public, he set up some very unusual rules that gave him absolute control. Similar at Google. They have voting power that outflanks all the other investors. So that they could bust the paradigm of going for maximum profits. Of course, if there weren't people who wanted to go for maximum profits, they probably never would have built a company.
It wouldn't be where they are today.
And that rich.
Right.
So these are people who come into it with a distorted set of values. Thing that says, the public be damned. And there is no true public interest. Because people who put public interest first almost never have the kind of drive that build companies. Remember, Mark Zuckerberg and Sergey Brin are not among the 10 richest men in the world, and they're all men, incidentally, because they're smarter or more able than thousands upon thousands of other people. Yes, they're extraordinarily smart and extraordinarily able, but there are thousands and thousands of others. They have a drive, and above all, as social scientists have been describing in many ways, they have luck. What makes somebody super rich, world class, world level rich, as opposed to just highly successful in life, is luck more than anything else. Very hard for people like that to realize it. But now that I'm old, I've been seeing a whole lot over the years. And one of the things I've seen is person after person who did phenomenally well, unbelievably well, deciding that meant they were God's gift. They became very rich because they were worthy and able. And in many cases, I've seen it turn around and seen them fall flat on their face. First time I saw that was not David Kay, what was his father's name? The founder of Kaypro, made the best small computer in 1982. $1,800 got you a complete computer with all the software you need. It had a small screen, but it had a bigger screen than anything else.
Wow, you're going back to the beginning of the PC nowadays. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, I happened to be a Kaypro dealer, so I knew the guy.
Mm-hmm.
Good, smart engineer. He had gone to school with Hewlett and Packard and thought he was smarter than they were, and maybe he was. But he happened to hit the right need at the right moment. His only big innovation was he made a 9-inch screen instead of a 5-inch screen. And that turned out to make all the difference.
Mm-hmm.
And the computers, because a 9-inch screen was still pretty darn small. And a 5-inch screen was almost unusable. But people bought it because that was the only thing under $3,000 in those days. And suddenly, he went public and was worth a few $100 million. At which point, it went off the rails because he was so sure that his particular form of veganism and his particular genius at building a company meant he was right about everything. And 3 years later, the company had fallen apart and was worthless.
Wow.
And I don't think he had cashed out very much and stayed very rich.
Mm-hmm.
But and the same is true of Mark Zuckerberg. There were at least 4 people who started Facebook. 5, I think. He was one of them. There were various shenanigans that went back and forth at the early days. And he wound up the one with Facebook and going.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what was Facebook? Facebook was created at Harvard for Harvard students to find sexual partners.
Wow.
Right. The early it turned out to be really good at connecting people, and it grew from there. But the early Facebook had a thing where you described your relationship with your friend, and one of the choices was, we hooked up.
Mm-hmm.
That was what it was about.
Wow. Now, a quick diversionary question, Dave. What did Facebook do that was different from MySpace, which in my mind was kind of the predecessor social media platform? Was it what you're talking about, the one-to-one connectivity, or what was the differentiator for them, for Facebook?
Mark was an extraordinary programmer, so apparently it ran better than other things. He was smart enough to see what was successful and multiply it. Not the fancy algorithms, just the ordinary business tactics.
Mm-hmm.
He has superb marketing. And the early marketing, if you recall, was you couldn't get it if you weren't at Harvard. So it was a very exclusive club that the Harvard people were happy to join and keep
Mm-hmm.
the Boston University plebes out of contention. And then it was just, you had to have the EDU, an educational email, to join. You had to be at the university. And that set it off as exclusive enough that it became very popular among college students who didn't want 70-year-old men hitting on them, which of course happens all the time today. And we have lots of 70 and 40-year-old men hitting on 11-year-old girls at Facebook.
Mm.
And that's another thing that they could and should have cut back on by getting some effective regulation of what went to 11-year-old girls or boys. And they resisted. In fact, they're trying to get the latest one was Instagram for Kids. Do you know that story?
No, I don't, Dave. What's that about?
Oh, Facebook has gotten so many of the people in the United States connected that it has no room to grow with its traditional audience. So it's trying to find more audiences. It's in India with more people in India than in the United States, I believe. India is 4 times our population, and the internet exploded in India. There are more Indians connected than the US has people. And so Facebook is doing everything possible there to grow, and has. And how did it grow in the US? Well, it figured it should go after the kids. And it had a big project for Instagram for Kids, trying to find a way that 6 and 9-year-olds could use Instagram, presumably making it awfully easy to learn and easy to log on, and having lots of silly filters, and I have no idea what else. But the idea that Instagram should take over kids' lives offended so many people, including in Congress, that about a week ago, they paused the project because some people, they never should have started it. There's no way you could build a safe environment for kids, even with the many, many things, some brilliant, that they intended to include to keep things safe. They weren't going to work.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody knew that. Or they would work sometimes, but not all the time. So, what I'm saying is that Facebook today, in the last year, made $37 billion. Because people expected it to continue to grow, the stock, which would have been worth 300 to 500 billion if that was a static company making maybe a little less, say $30 billion, was worth over $1 trillion, and growth was a total imperative. That imperative is really hurting Facebook in a lot of ways. They went extreme on their algorithms. The internal employees are telling us they made choice after choice that wasn't in the user's interest, but did increase engagement and keep people on the system and looking at more ads. Former Facebook product manager, I'm quoting from the Times, turned whistleblower Frances Haugen, says, Facebook has not earned our blind faith. The behavior that I saw at Facebook was choosing to prioritize its profits over people. Now that's capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
Capitalism in its most naked form.
All right.
And capitalism, well, probably should be restrained in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the way it used to be. Once upon a time, we talked about social contract and bargains and corporate social responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have a revolution in the 1930s in this country, possibly because Roosevelt decided that unbridled capitalism, which was leaving tens of millions on the verge of starvation in the United States in 1933, cue all the stories about bread lines,
Mm-hmm.
shanty fells. Wasn't stable and took a lot of actions which were deeply opposed by the establishment, like setting up Social Security
All right.
for old people,
Mm-hmm.
creating jobs with the Work Progress Administration, and many, many things, because capitalism does many things that work and many things that don't. And dealing with the many things that don't is something that we need to get back to. But
Yeah.
meanwhile, we need to take a break, I think.
Yeah, let's take a break and catch our breath because this is a heavy issue, needless to say. You listen to WHCR 90.3, the voice of Harlem, Community and Technology with Stu Reed and Dave Burstein. We'll be right back after a short musical break.
Autumn in New York, why does it seem so inviting? Autumn in New York, it spells the thrill of first nighting. Glittering crowds and shimmering clouds in canyons of steel, they're making me feel I'm home. It's autumn in New York that brings the promise of new love. Autumn in New York is often mingled with pain. Dreamers with empty hands may sigh for exotic lands. It's autumn in New York. It's good to live it again.
Autumn in New York, the gleaming rooftops at sundown. Oh, autumn in New York, it lifts you up when you run down. Yes, Jerry Ruiz and Gay Voices who lunch at the Ritz will tell you that it's divine. This autumn in New York.
Hey, we're back. This is Community and Technology on WHCR 90.3. You're listening to Dave Burstein and Stu Reed. And we've been talking about Facebook and some of the failures of the big tech social media companies to really protect people. And the conversation kind of evolved, Dave, to where we're really looking at the social responsibility of corporate America in general. And, you know, we've kind of lost the corporate responsibility that, as we were talking before the break, came in during the FDR administration, when the country was really on the brink of losing it, the Great Depression, and so much unrest in the country. FDR came in with many social programs, the WPA, the work program, Social Security was born under his administration. And I believe the whole notion of social safety net was put in place probably for the first time in this country during his administration. In many ways, the social safety net may still be there, although folks can argue that it's been eroded in many ways. But certainly the culture of corporate responsibility, corporate social responsibility, is kind of null and void today. And, can we legislate that back? You're talking about one of the scientists at Facebook that wrote a story about how the algorithms at Facebook and others amplify so much negativity, inflammatory, hate speech to help drive viewership and engagement and their profits. And this particular writer suggested that the giants, Facebook, Google, and others, be held liable for the consequences of that amplification. Is that something that can actually be legislated, Dave? Do you think? I know we can talk about it theoretically, but is there any practical way for that to happen in your mind?
Yes.
Okay.
A lot of it's already happening. And there is a remarkable consensus in Washington, Democrats and Republicans, probably 80 senators worth, who think that Facebook should be regulated. They haven't decided or haven't come to agree on what that regulation should be. On the Republicans, they think that Facebook is out of hand and needs to be regulated because it censors Republicans like Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
On the left, lots of people want to censor hate speech and the amplification of it. Well, many of them want to censor hate speech, period. I'm uncomfortable with that, but many people, and I think Stu, you're among them, thinks hate speech should be a crime. Racism should be a crime.
I do. The trickier, blurry line to me is, the hate speech is kind of obvious, and I agree. Not that you said it, but I will say I think that should be illegal. But the trickier part is all the misinformation that is being propagated across the internet. How do we begin to regulate that, if it even can be?
Well, Jessica Rosenworcel, the acting chairwoman of the FCC, is one of the most honest, ethical people I've met in politics. Very hardworking, very smart. How do we get her to not lie that the program, which has $3 billion to subsidize some people's internet service, is not, in fact, bringing people online who aren't online, as she did lie in the official announcement not long ago. It turns out that the $50 a month program, which I urge all of our listeners to sign up for, does in fact help some people who were relatively poor, but it hasn't been organized well enough to reach the people who weren't connected, which was its stated purpose.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, and this is from the Los Angeles Times, and I fact-checked it with the FCC myself, the vast bulk of people signing up already were connected. I think Comcast, which had a very admirable $10 a month service for the poor, or service for the poor with children in school, persuaded an awful lot of those people that they should instead sign up with the $50 a month service.
Yeah, well, that's the big guys gaming the system, is it not, Dave? The big providers gaming the system to get more revenue.
Of course, they're going to game the system. Mm-hmm. That's what they do. And Comcast has been actually more ethical than most in this stuff. The program actually does connect a whole lot of poor people, and they've worked very hard to promote it through the schools. But it was misconceived in the first place because it was a program that was designed to connect all the unconnected, something that even Republicans like David Reddle on a panel I was with, Trump's first choice for the NTIA head chief, thought was socially necessary, that everybody needed to be connected in this time of a pandemic.
Mhm.
But the way they wrote the rules didn't get it going for the people who weren't connected.
So
That's
this is a case where you're saying there was the intent, political intent for a social responsibility, but then the actual execution missed the mark.
Yeah, and that presumably was because the lobbyists wrote many of the rules.
Mm-hmm.
And because we're discovering it's really hard thing to get to the last 10% of people, most of whom are challenged in life by many things, a large percentage of whom are illiterate, would have trouble using the internet. Others are homeless or seriously disabled, including by drugs. And it's very, very hard to define a program. So Jessica is lying to herself when she thinks her program is successful because 5 million people have signed up. Most of them are relatively poor. You can sign up if your income is up to $2,400 in New York State and you're single, $2,400 a month,
Mm-hmm.
and the right age, and so on. And it's good that we're helping poor people, but that wasn't what the program was about. It wasn't. It's similarly, we have $40 billion coming to real broadband, supported by people who think this is going to bring broadband to the people who aren't connected, not realizing that the details of the program essentially means they're going to give away an awful lot of money, mostly to phone companies, to compete where cable already brings a perfectly decent connection, including the one on which I'm talking to you now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Dave, now my question about that is this the typical corporate two-step where they know that they are pulling the wool over our eyes and they're masquerading as a social good and they're really just enriching themselves, which we've seen as a tried and true corporate activity? Or is there real political will to do the right thing and somehow it's just getting fumbled?
Both.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of honorable people, including most of the people supporting this. And I'm talking about people like Susan Crawford, Tom Wheeler, and Tim Wu, who are making a bloody mistake because they don't actually understand the networks in the US and what they're promoting.
Mm-hmm.
You can bring a connection to everybody who doesn't have cable, or to 99% of everybody, for about a quarter of the money they intend to spend.
Mm.
In Susan's case and in Wheeler's case, they don't understand that cable is now shipping the equipment that'll bring it to parity with fiber for a decade or more, getting upstream speeds of 100 megabits and even a gigabit. And that equipment is now reaching the field and is so cheap it's going to be installed whether or not there's a big federal subsidy. So 90% of the country is going to have a decent connection available for them. And about half of the remainder are already set to get fiber in other programs like RDOF and NTIA, and $7 billion from the state of California. So there really are some people who need a connection who can't get it, but they're not nearly as many. And you couldn't spend $40 billion connecting them if you made the fiber optics with gold plating, which is what's going to happen in effect.
Mm-hmm.
They did after some people. Meanwhile, there are, what's the right number? 10 times as many, no, not 10 times, 4 times as many people unconnected because they can't afford it. So they did the right thing when they changed the rules so that a quarter of the money may go to subsidizing some of the poor, although that's being done in a way that half of it remains a corporate giveaway.
Right.
And that was what they thought they had to do to get it through. They had to come up with a program that AT&T and Comcast were comfortable with so that they could get it approved. And that turned out to be a program that wasted about half the money on a subsidy that's bigger than it needs to be. We had that show. Remember when we had Scott Walston on here?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
And Scott,
And, you know, yeah, he talked about how multiple providers in a given market does not drive the price down.
well, multiple does if you get enough of them.
Yeah, right. More than like 2 or 3.
Yeah. You need 4 to 7, and the experience with 4 is very mixed. Sometimes it's enough to have competition drive prices down, and sometimes it's not. It wasn't in the US wireless until 4 years ago when T-Mobile was facing virtual bankruptcy and they broke away from the cartel, which had 4 carriers at that point. He also said that if the government could do it for $15. My number was a little bit higher, and allow the companies to still make a profit. Because the marginal cost of, for example, putting everybody in public housing in New York on the network of Charter Spectrum would be $3 to $8 a month per home. So $30 was too much. It was about twice what needed to be spent, Scott figured. My number was it probably should have been about 20 to 25, the way the system works, but certainly shouldn't have been 30. But it's 30. And that's in the bill. But half the money being spent on broadband is wasting corporate welfare. Now that's coming from some of the very best people in the business. People like Tim Wu, the Columbia professor who defined net neutrality and is redefining antitrust and is in the White House. Susan Crawford, one of the smartest, most dedicated people I've met in this business, but she has a fetish that cable doesn't work and it needs to be fiber. She even wrote a book about why you have to have fiber, and she's brilliant. People sometimes get things wrong. And she's been very influential. So yes, it's also some very good people for noble reasons. They want everybody to have a robust connection because that will make us a stronger country. Have made mistakes in what it would take. Mostly it's what the conservative Republican economists, they weren't particularly Republican, what conservative economists pointed out is that regulation rarely works well. That what happens is what they call regulatory capture. That the people who regulate, decent people, want to be honorable, but the system makes it very hard for them to go against the industry, which has such an enormous $500 billion interest one way. And we've certainly seen that again and again. The classic study on that, once upon a time, some states regulated electric prices and some states didn't. What do you think the effect was, Stu?
Well, I remember when a recent example was that Texas deregulated, and then there was some weather event, and all of a sudden the prices went crazy through the roof because it was an opportunity for the energy companies to gouge. So that was certainly a negative effect.
Well, it turns out, and this was years ago when they did it, decades ago, when they looked across the states that regulated and the states that didn't, they found the prices were almost identical.
Hmm.
But the regulation was making very little difference. It's a classic paper by George Stigler, who won a Nobel Prize for this and much other work, and Claire Friedland, his longtime research associate, who happens to be my aunt. That's the one that constantly gets referenced in the academic discussions of does regulation work. And in this case, they did a large study, and it seemed to make very little difference.
Mm-hmm.
I still believe in regulation. I believe you have to fight for good regulation.
Yeah. Well, you know, I'd like to circle back, Dave, because we're kind of winding down the last few minutes. I'd like to circle back. And, you know, we began the show talking about Facebook and their algorithms and how, you know, they just drive all of the insanity that we see in the social media space with inflammatory speech, sexual content, etc. And, you know, one of the ex-Facebook scientists proposed in terms of a regulatory scheme, what she said was one, just breaking up the company, Facebook and others, would just result in a lot of other smaller companies, smaller in quotes, doing the same thing. And what she proposed was that the regulation make the social media companies responsible, I guess financially responsible for the impact of some of the algorithms. Do you think, is that feasible as a regulatory scheme? You know, I know you just talked about how the regulators get captured by the enormous political, financial power of the companies that they're trying to regulate. But my question is that a way to somehow to regulate the impact of these algorithms and to make companies responsible for the impact? It sounded kind of pie in the sky as I read that. How do you measure, how do you quantify that? I'm just interested in your take on that particular regulatory proposal.
Yeah, saying that you're not going to change the rule that the Facebooks and the YouTubes are not suable based on what their people said, unless they amplify it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, amplifying it, they do because they amplify, especially amplify the extreme speech, because that people respond to it and they stay on the system longer, and it increases engagement and increases the number of commercials and clicks that they get. That would probably make a difference, whether it's a trivial difference or a significant difference. We don't have any data. My guess is it wouldn't be a significant difference, but it's certainly a plausible approach. It certainly will not solve most of the problems, like Google and Facebook not putting a simple link on their homepage to where you could get COVID tests and vaccinations, which is the kind of socially responsible thing that should have been done, and in this case, most dramatically, would have saved thousands of lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I certainly agree with you wholeheartedly, Dave. Well, we're about out of time. This has been Stu Reed and Dave Burstein kicking around potential solutions and approaches to regulating some of the crazy speech on the internet, some of the negative impacts of misinformation, and kind of talking really about ultimately social responsibility of major corporations. And I don't know that we came up with any solutions per se, but certainly some ideas to consider. So Dave, any final comments before we close out?
Well, we talked about the $50 federal subsidy.
Mm-hmm.
You definitely should go for it if you qualify. And if you have kids in school, It's wide open in many school districts. You should definitely go for it.
Yes, it's called the Emergency Broadband Benefit, EBB. So check it
And if
out.
you do stamps, it's automatic, and so on.
Mhm.
I pay about $22 a month for my wireless, which has all the data I want, plus all my calls and so on.
Mhm.
That's TracFone. There are other deals out there like it. But the most interesting one just came from Boost, which is now part of Dish. Again, $22, but in a different form. They will, if you buy the $279 new 5G phone they're offering, they will give you 12 months with unlimited calls and text and 35 gigabytes a month for 12 months, which works out to about $22 a month. In other words, it's a free phone. It's 6.5 inches. It has 4 cameras, and I'm sure it's a perfectly decent phone. And I went and I bought it because it's a really good deal and it's worth knowing.
Okay. Well, thanks for that tip. This has been Community and Technology with Dave Bernstein and Stu Reed. You're listening to WHCR 90.3 FM. Stay tuned next Wednesday, 5 to 6 p.m. Thanks for tuning in.